Apple pie, one of, if not the most popular fruit pies in the world. It is one of the staples of American cultural influence. As a child, I was convinced the smell of warm apple pie would beckon me to come hither, and then later in life it obtained a different type of formative influence. In all of this, it is used to depict quintessential American-ness. Be it wholesome home cooking, cooling on a windowsill, or a more libertine approach to life, seasoned with poppy skate punk music and red cups. No, really, those red cups, solo cups I believe they're called, are for us Europeans about as strong an identifier as the Stars and Stripes and Stetson hats. We don't get those over here. But anyway, back to apple pie. I've lived in Europe all my life and have never set foot in the USA. And even I am very familiar with the phrase "as American as apple pie," the famous comparative catchphrase that emphasizes how American any given thing is. But why? Apple pies in various forms were around long before the United States or even the start of the colonization of the New World. Heck, apples aren't even native to the Americas. So why, when you want to emphasize how American something is, do we compare it to this seemingly random fruit tart? Especially since there are so many New World crops. Why not as American as cornbread? Well, the answer is weirdly interesting and involves colonialism, botany, literature, and opera singers. And we're going to have a look at all of it before we have some delicious pie. So first, quick history of apples. Apples were initially domesticated in Central Asia and then made their way west to the Middle East and Europe, where they became a very popular eating fruit. Over time, it became one, if not the most popular fruits, even making its way into the Bible's creation story. That's all we need to know about apples for now. The other history we need to brush up on before we get to our beloved apple pies is that of the pie. It's pretty common knowledge these days that pies in medieval times served as containers. The crusts were, back then, called coffins. Sounds kinda dark, but it makes sense when you think of the pastry crust more as a container rather than a part of the meal. So there's this notion these days that the coffins were just discarded, but that's probably not true. It's true that these stale pie crusts were probably not as pleasant as what we used to these days. For example, the paste in the form of curry uses only water, flour and eggs, while other pastes out there were shortened with lard or suet rather than the butter we are used to these days. Eggs and flour in the Middle Ages were still very valuable though. So were suet and lard. People often forget this, but flour was precious. You needed to harvest the wheat, separate the chaff, mill it, sieve it. With pre-industrial technology, it's a lot of work. So the idea that the coffins were just chucked is a bit... it just doesn't sit right. Now, it is very probable that the pie crusts weren't eaten by the people that the pies were made for, but that someone down the ladder got that honor. Bit like what we saw with trencher bread back in the day. That or they were saved for later. There are actually quite a few historical recipes for stews and soups using leftover crusts, and these crusts were likely what these recipes were referring to. Okay, that's enough of that tangent, back to apple pie. The oldest recipe we have for apple pie is from Britain. It's in the aforementioned form of curry, and it is a typical coffin pie like we just explained. No mention on how to make the coffin, and the contents seem to resemble apple sauce more than anything. Because of the existence of this recipe, a lot of people will say, well, you know, apple pie is actually British. Wikipedia even has the origin of apple pie down as British. Now, this is indeed the oldest surviving recipe for apple pie, but that's probably more of a testament to British record keeping and source preservation than it is culinary prowess. As we saw, apples were around during antiquity, and the practice of putting food into coffins was ubiquitous across Europe. So the pie in the form of curry being the first one, I highly doubt it. Not impossible, but very unlikely. Where was the first? Don't know, and it doesn't really matter for this video. What we need to remember is that apple pies were already around, albeit in a very different form, and from the country that was going to have a lot, if not the most, cultural influence on the United States just a few centuries down the road. When the cook and I start research, we usually, if we don't already have a bit of an idea where to start, we start very broad. Articles, Wikipedia, even blog posts. The thing that we hope for is that they leave their references, which then allows us to zero in on people who are considered authorities on the subject. And then we check for articles or books written by these people. However, with the question, why is something as American as apple pie, we clearly weren't the first to ask this. And there are so many articles and little posts out there, ranging from articles in prominent sounding magazines to little blurbs intended to boost SEO before an online recipe. And they all have widely varying stories, often with some mention of the World War II expression "for mom an apple pie," which is something we'll get to. In tons of these blogs and articles, we saw a lot of people point out that the British apple pie is the aforementioned stodgy coffin version, and that the edible pastry came from the Dutch. From the off, I can tell you that's rubbish. The evolution of pastry wasn't limited to specific European countries. The notion of the Dutch originating edible pie pastry and, to a lesser extent, the lattice top you see on apple pies these days, is usually attributed to a recipe in Een Notabel Boekjen van Kokerijen, the first Dutch language cookbook. Here it is. However, as someone who can read this recipe without an LLM hallucinating fairies and unicorns into it, there is no mention of any lattice top here. It even calls the top a lid. It's very akin to most other pies of the era, be they British or French or further abroad. So where did the lattice come from? From what we were able to find, the lattice started appearing in paintings and books in the 17th century, and not in one specific place. It looks like it had its origins in France or Italy, can't really say for sure, but we quickly see it appear in art from Antwerp and cookbooks from London. And the tops of the pies getting nicer wasn't the only change we can see happening. In the 16th century, we already see more and more recipes all over Europe begin to give instructions on how to make the crust nicer. This happened everywhere, but since our audience is mostly English speaking, here's a quick recipe for short paste from A Proper New Book of Cookery, published in 1545. Take fine flour and a kersey of fair water and a dish of sweet butter and a little saffron and the yolks of 2 eggs and make it thin and tender as ye may. Fine flour, eggs, butter and saffron. That last one is still expensive today. It's pretty clear that this dough was meant to be eaten, and not just by the staff or used as a thickening agent in a stew, and certainly not chucked away willy-nilly. In 1724, Leonard Wellsted published a poem, which is an ode to apple pie. I'm not going to read out the whole poem because... exactly. But we'll of course link it below. This passage is interesting though. When first this infant dish in fashion came, the ingredients were but coarse and rude the frame. As yet unpolished in the modern arts, our fathers ate brown bread instead of tarts. Pies were but indigested lumps of dough, till time and just expense improved them so. Even in this 18th century poem, they write about how pies, and especially apple pies, have gotten more refined over time. This guy wrote funny poems about food history, trying to package history trivia in like a general funny method. How droll. Oh, yeah. Anyway, it's pretty safe to say that people were not chucking away their pie crusts until one Dutchman decided not to. Once the pie, apple or otherwise, came to America, it quickly became a success and it began to evolve. As one 19th century writer put it, "The pie is an English institution which, planted on American soil, forthwith ran rampant and burst forth into an untold variety of genera and species. Not merely the old traditional mince pie, but 1,000 strictly American seedlings from the main stock, evinced the power of American housewives to adapt old institutions to new uses. Pumpkin pies, cranberry pies, huckleberry pies, cherry pies, green currant pies, peach, pear and plum pies, custard pies, apple pies," finally I was getting a bit worried there, "Marlborough pudding pies, pies with top crusts and pies without, pies adorned with all sorts of fanciful flutings and architectural strips laid across and around, and otherwise varied, attested boundless fertility of the feminine mind when once let loose in a given direction." Wow, that sure is some pie passion. The writer of this little text? Harriet Beecher Stowe. Yes, she of Uncle Tom's Cabin, abolitionist icon and lover of pie. We agree. So we can see that the American pioneers loved and built upon pies brought from their native countries. But why was apple pie the one that became a symbol? Apples aren't native to the New World, unlike, for example, pumpkins. Pumpkin pie, also very popular, is seen as a typical American thing. And it was the first in Harriet Beecher Stowe's list. But it is not the pie on the movie posters and army slogans. That's still apple pie. So again, we are faced asking, why? You could say it was the most popular in Britain, see Wellstead's poem, and Britain had the strongest influence on American culture. Now, it's true that Britain had a strong cultural influence, but we found something more to it. And it's very interesting. It's not one nicely defined reason, but a bunch of reasons working in sweet, sour and crisp harmony. Yes, better get puzzling. Firstly, the apple, botanically speaking, really liked the New World. I'm not a biologist or a botanist, but apparently the soil and weather in the New World is excellent for apple trees. So the trees the pioneers brought over literally blossomed. Also, it makes sense that a fruit popular in Europe would be popular among predominantly European settlers. So in 1796, relatively shortly after the American War of Independence, we get our first American recipe for apple pie. Amelia Simmons writes in her book American Cookery, "Stew and strain the apples to every 3 pints, grate the peel of a fresh lemon. Add cinnamon, mace, rosewater and sugar to your taste." This is a very simple recipe and it appears to take influences from plenty of places. The lemon zest is reminiscent of a recipe by Hannah Glass. Funny thing is that the American recipe calls for apples to be stewed in advance, which is something Hannah Glass skips. There are some recipes from France that we found that do call for a stewing, roasting or blanching of the apples, so it seems that the cultural melting pot was already beginning to bubble. It is, however, in the 19th century that we really see apples and apple pie take root in the American psyche, especially as apples seemed to have become a symbol of the taming of the West and that frontier spirit. One man who played a very large part in all of that was, yes, you've guessed it, Johnny Appleseed, who probably didn't wear a pot on his head, although he was notably a very eccentric character, but above all a shrewd businessman. Johnny Appleseed, real name John Chapman, was a frontiersman who bought plenty of cheap plots of land and sowed them with apple seeds. Then, when time and nature did their thing, he would sell the land, now an orchard, for a tidy profit. Very American. And I mean that in a good way, innovation and free enterprise. Problem was that 90% of apples from these orchards would have been horrible. for eating, that is. Now, again, I am not a biologist and this is sort of botanical history, not my field, but I learned the following from a SciShow video, so if you don't agree, go yell at Hank Green. Thing is that when you grow an apple tree from a seed, the genetics of the apples sort of jumble themselves, and the apples they produce usually taste pretty awful. About 1 in 100 apple trees grown from seeds is apparently nice. The apples you actually eat these days are grown via grafting. So most of Johnny Appleseed's trees would have borne some horrible apples. Does this mean that Johnny Appleseed ripped off all the people who bought his orchards? No, not at all. They all knew the apples were probably inedible and didn't mind, because they intended to use them for hard cider production anyway. And apparently you don't need nice apples for that. This planting flurry, be it by Chapman or others like him, did apparently result in some varieties which are still very loved today. And plenty of their apples may have been too sour to eat by themselves, but would have made for fine cooking apples. One of America's most prominent historical food writers attributes the success of fruit pies in general to frontier wives, because they stacked well and in colder areas kept well. That's the pies, not the wives. So we now already have a large chunk of our puzzle. People on the frontier made fruit pies, and the fruit that was easily available were apples, as the orchards were pretty much everywhere. As a bonus, they were already one of the most popular fruits in Europe, where the lion's share of these frontier settlers came from. If the apples were too sour because they were one of the funkier varieties, not to worry, just add some more sugar. In the later part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th, the temperance movement would start to promote apple-based dishes as an alternative to hard cider. A lovely example of these fruit and particularly apple-based treats really blossoming in the New World seems to be among the Pennsylvania Dutch. People from the German Palatinate settled in, well, Pennsylvania. Armed with recipes and techniques from the Old World and blessed with New World abundance, they quickly developed an entirely new cuisine. And a big part of this was apple preserves like apple pie and fritters. So it's a combination of many pieces, but it is clear to see why America, especially when it was pushing the frontier, took a liking to apple pie. We can see it already becoming something of a cultural staple in the 19th century. Mark Twain, no less, writes fondly about apple pie and other apple-based sweet dishes. The funniest by far is his recipe for a New England apple pie from A Tramp Abroad. I don't really know what accent Mark Twain had, so here goes. To make this excellent breakfast dish, proceed as follows. Take a sufficiency of water and a sufficiency of flour and construct a bulletproof dough. It's American, all right. Work this into the form of a disc, with the edges turned up some 3/4 of an inch. Toughen and kiln dry it a couple of days in a mild but unvarying temperature. Construct a cover for this readout in the same way and the same material. Fill with stewed dried apples, aggravate with cloves, lemon peel, and a slab of citron. Add 2 portions of New Orleans sugar. Then solder on a lid and set in a safe place until it petrifies. Serve cold at breakfast and invite your enemy. Jokes aside, we do think it's interesting that, like Amelia Simmons, but unlike Hannah Glass, Twain recommends the apples are stewed, that is, before they are said to be petrified in bulletproof pastry, which might have been the norm in America at the time due to the abundance of more cider-appropriate apples, but that is just an educated guess. We don't know whether this love was the product of the presence of apples, the European heritage, the temperance movement, or any other of the many suggested explanations that we haven't even mentioned. In all likelihood, it was a mixture of all of them. A lovely way to sum it all up comes from Harriet Beecher Stowe's brother, Henry Ward Beecher. a preacher and, like his sister, fierce abolitionist. We know his sister liked all pies, but Henry had a preference. Blessed be the unknown person who invented the apple pie. Did I know where the grave of that person was, methinks I would make a devout pilgrimage thither, and rear a monument over it that should mark the spot to the latest generations. Of all pies of every name, the apple pie is easily the first and chief. He goes on, not that apple is no longer apple. It too is transformed, and the final pie, though born of apple, sugar, butter, nutmeg, cinnamon, lemon, did he sneak a recipe in here? Is unlike none of these, but the ideal of them all, refined, purified, and by fire fixed in blissful perfection. That family sure had a way with words. So it looks like apple pie naturally grew to become intertwined with the American psyche, possibly aided by the wave of nationalism in the 19th century that prompted a search for symbols and a shared story. Although we don't have hard proof of that. Yes, we're almost there. But first we have to address the question, the phrase as American as apple pie. Where did it come from? The earliest we could find is the magazine World Outlook, published by the Board of Foreign Missions of the Methodist Episcopal Church. Essentially a church doing a bunch of foreign missions, and this magazine reports on how they're going. This issue was published in 1920, and some of the headlines have not aged that well. Just beware of that if you want to do your own reading on this. In one article, they write about how foreigners welcomed to their mission in Chester are being Americanized by letting them take showers. I'm sure they meant well, but yeah. Baths are as American as apple pie, it says in the article. If I'm honest, bit underwhelming, but don't worry, there's a more fun one. It is admittedly from 1 year later, but it's a lot more fun, and Walter Levi theorizes it was this one that launched the quote into the public consciousness. On 3rd July 1921, opera singer Alice Gentle gave an interview with the Decatur Sunday Daily Review. She was performing in an opera in nearby Chicago at the time. She had spent most of her time performing European operas and was asked whether American operas would one day be a thing. She replied, "It's coming. The opera of Main Street and as American as apple pie, wheat cakes, corn on the cob, barbecues, Mississippi River steamboats, one-night stands, and mail-order houses. And say, I am going to sing in that opera." I've always wanted to do a transatlantic accent. Regardless where it started, from here on, the expression went and got more and more nestled in with the common psyche as a symbol of the American way of life. In World War II, a popular expression among soldiers was that they fought for mum and apple pie, which then later, according to some, evolved into the descriptor motherhood and apple pie, to refer to traditional values. How the world would have been different if Alice Gentle had started with the one-night stands. In media and literature throughout the 20th century, we see apple pie become this symbol of simple, honest American living. For instance, Where the Car Turns at 18th by Edna Ferber tells this tale of a young man led astray by temptation, and in doing so, he leaves his tea and apple pie. Today, that might sound reactionary and conservative, but it isn't necessarily so. And the apple pie has been this symbol of home and good living across society, independent of political and cultural leanings. For example, Jack Kerouac's On the Road, Bible of the Beat Generation, not exactly hardcore conservatism, arguably also depicts apple pie as a symbol of good, simple, wholesome life. The author is nostalgic for it, as he eats tons of it while he is on the road. Ah yes, the cooking. We got this book, hoping to find the recipe for quintessential American pie, only to discover that there isn't one. No, there is no one American apple pie. There are many American apple pies. This entire book is just short descriptors of areas of the United States and how their history and demographic makeup shapes their local apple pie. From fruit stand pies to pies with some cider in the crust. One pie recipe from New Mexico even has green chilies. One recipe requires the apple pie to be blended into a milkshake. It's gloriously decadent and we kinda love it. The book is delightful and we might come back to it one day. If you want to make sure you don't miss those, please subscribe. It really helps us. If you are already a subscriber, would you be so kind to please leave us a like? Thank you very much. Also, while you're down there, if you're American, can you share your local apple pie? No need to give a detailed recipe, just a description will do, and if possible, the history or story, doesn't have to be true, attached to it. Now for our pie. We thought about making the excellent apple pie from Catherine Beecher, sister of Harriet and Henry, that family. It uses preserving techniques, so it really evokes that frontier spirit. However, it uses soup dishes and just an upper crust, which makes it closer to what people think of as British pie, undercrust being optional, which feels wrong for this video. Therefore, we are opting for the recipe from Lydia Maria Child. Sadly, no relation to Julia Child, but I did read the entire recipe in her voice. She published The American Frugal Housewife, dedicated to those who are not ashamed of economy, in 1832. So, it might have been the pie Mark Twain had. As per usual, back then, the crust and pie are separate recipes. So, first up, the crust. Lydia instructs us to essentially make a rough puff paste with a 1:2 butter to flour ratio. Although she does advise that a quarter of the flour is set aside for dusting, so it might end up being a bit more than 1:2 butter to flour. She recommends some techniques and also points out that this should be done as cold as possible, just shy of freezing, a trick you will see repeated in modern recipes. Therefore, we are going to chill our dough a bit before rolling it out. We think this would have been fine if we did it in winter, but at the time of filming it is warm. Why do you think I look like this? Then for the pie. Lydia tells us to stew the apples first, although she does admit that this is optional, and a lot of people don't do this. She informs us that not stewing preserves more of the spirit of the apples, whereas stewing allows for the spices to mix better. We are instructed to sugar to taste, as it will depend on the nature of the apple, which makes us think there were still quite a few of those cider apples kicking about. Then she recommends some salt, a small amount of butter, cloves and cinnamon, along with some lemon brandy and rose water. None of these are essential. They're all just recommendations. If, after all of that, the pie still lacks spirit, as she calls it, grate in some lemon. Although the recipe doesn't mention a lattice, we did give the lattice simply because it would feel wrong not to have one. We're not told how to bake it, but we baked it in our oven at 180 degrees Celsius until ready, which took us between 40 and 50 minutes. And there we go, real American apple pie, as per Lydia Maria Child. A real icon. No, really, look her up, she's pretty cool. We are serving ours with some vanilla ice cream, which only became a thing in the late 19th century, early 20th, something around there, but you know, let's indulge. This looks lovely. We should have a drink with this. What was it that guy was having before he fell to temptation? Tea, yes. This should go with some tea. Do we have a typical American tea? Oh, I know there's Southern sweet tea, but this has enough sugar. And we want something to commemorate the United States' 250th birthday. Ooh, I've got it. Yes, join us in a few weeks when we have a look and a taste of the tea that was chucked into the Boston Harbor. We hope you enjoyed our look at American apple pie and that you'll join us for part 2, where we wrap up these birthday celebrations. Thank you very much for watching.